It started with a laugh, not the kind that makes a room brighter, but one that slices through the air like a knife. A cruel, echoing laugh in the middle of a crowded diner, filled with the smell of burnt toast, black coffee, and fried eggs. The kind of laugh that makes everyone look up, but no one dares say a word. It came from Officer Greg Turner, a man everyone in town knew, or at least thought they did. Greg was the kind of cop who walked around with an overconfident grin, always joking, always lightening the mood. But this time, his joke would shake his department, his reputation, and his entire life. That morning started like any other in the small town of Fairview. The same regulars sat in their same booths. The same waitress, Linda, hustled back and forth, calling out orders to the kitchen. Nothing seemed different until the doorbell chimed and a young black man stepped inside. He wore a simple black hoodie, jeans, and carried nothing but a notebook and quiet confidence. His name was Malcolm Reed. No one knew him. No one even noticed him until Greg did. Malcolm chose a seat at the counter, ordered pancakes and coffee, and began jotting something in his notebook. His movements calm, precise, deliberate. But Greg's attention locked on him almost immediately. Maybe it was the uniformed ego inside him, or maybe it was the quiet strength that radiated from Malcolm's stillness, the kind that unsettles men who mistake silence for weakness. Greg leaned back on his stool, smirking, and whispered something to Linda as she passed by. She gave him a disapproving glance, but he just grinned wider. Moments later, Linda returned with a plate of scrambled eggs for another customer. Greg's eyes followed her, and in one sudden, stupid burst of arrogance, he snatched the plate right from her hands. Time seemed to slow. Before anyone could react, he dumped the entire thing on Malcolm's head. The diner fell silent. Forks froze midair. Cups stopped clinking. All you could hear was the slow drip of yolk hitting the counter and the sound of someone's breath catching. Then came Greg's voice, loud, mocking, cruel. "Oops," he said, smirking. "Guess I mistook you for the garbage can." For a moment, the silence cracked into uneasy laughter. Some people chuckled, others turned away, pretending not to see. A woman gasped softly. One old man in the corner muttered, "He shouldn't have done that," shaking his head. But Malcolm didn't move. He didn't shout, didn't raise his hand, didn't even flinch. He just sat there, perfectly still, as the eggs slid down his face, dripping onto the counter, his notebook now stained but still open. His calmness was eerie, powerful, like the quiet before a storm that everyone knows is coming but no one can stop. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. It made Greg shift uncomfortably in his seat. He expected anger, maybe a punch, something to justify his behavior. But the man sitting in front of him gave him nothing, just quiet eyes and controlled breathing. And that silence? It was louder than any yell could ever be. Linda's hands trembled as she whispered, "Greg, what did you do?" But Greg only laughed again, though this time it sounded hollow, forced. "Relax," he said. "It's just a joke. Can't the guy take a joke?" Malcolm finally moved. Slowly, methodically, he reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a small black wallet. He placed it gently on the counter next to his coffee cup. The diner's fluorescent lights glinted off the gold lettering. The words were unmistakable. FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The laughter died instantly. Greg's smirk faded, replaced by confusion, then fear. His mouth opened, but no words came out. The color drained from his face. Malcolm wiped a drip of egg from his forehead with a napkin, then turned to face Greg directly for the first time. His voice was calm, almost too calm. "You sure you want to keep this joke going?" Every eye in the diner locked on them. Even the cook had stepped out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron, watching in stunned silence. Greg's lips moved, trying to form an excuse, but no sound escaped. His badge suddenly felt heavy. The gun on his belt, meaningless. All the authority he carried moments ago evaporated in an instant. Malcolm slid a card across the counter. It read, "Special Agent Malcolm Reed, FBI Internal Affairs Division." The waitress gasped. Someone in the back whispered, "FBI?" Greg stumbled back a step. His mind raced. Internal Affairs? FBI? Was this real? He tried to laugh it off again, but his throat was dry. "Hey, I didn't know," he began, but Malcolm raised his hand, silencing him. "Now you do," Malcolm said quietly. The stillness that followed was suffocating. Greg's face turned red, a mix of embarrassment, fear, and something deeper, realization. Realization that he'd just humiliated not just a man, but the one person in the room who could change everything for him. Malcolm stood up, straightened his hoodie, and adjusted his notebook. "You know," he said softly, "you can tell a lot about a man by how he treats someone he thinks is beneath him." Then, without another word, he walked toward the door. Every step echoed. Every person in that diner watched him leave, silently, knowing they'd just witnessed something they'd never forget. The door chimed as it closed behind him. Greg stood frozen, staring at the egg-stained counter, the FBI card still glinting under the light. The weight of what he'd done hit him all at once, heavier than any badge he'd ever worn. Outside, Malcolm walked down the quiet street, his reflection mirrored in the diner's window. His expression never changed. Calm, controlled. But behind those eyes, a storm was brewing. One that would soon shake not just Greg Turner, but the entire police department of Fairview. And that morning, as the whispers began, as phones came out to record, as one teenager uploaded the clip online, a story was born. One that would travel faster than fire and leave a trail no one could ignore. Because in that diner, respect wasn't just lost. It was measured, and the man who thought he held all the power had just learned, the hard way, what real authority looks like. News spreads fast in small towns. It travels quicker than light, faster than truth, and long before anyone gets a chance to explain themselves, everyone already has an opinion. By noon, what happened in that tiny Fairview diner wasn't just gossip. It was a full-blown scandal. The video, shaky and grainy, filmed from a teenager's phone behind a napkin holder, was already making its rounds on social media. The caption read, "Local cop dumps food on black man. Instantly regrets it." The footage was less than 30 seconds long, but it told a story the town could no longer hide. A man in uniform humiliating a stranger, followed by that single, devastating moment when the stranger revealed an FBI badge. The internet ate it up. Thousands of shares, millions of views, and a tidal wave of outrage that crashed into Fairview like a storm. Inside the police department, chaos erupted. Phones rang nonstop. News vans parked outside the precinct. Reporters shouted questions as officers tried to slip through side doors. The chief, an aging man named Harold Dempsey, called an emergency meeting and released a statement calling the whole thing a misunderstanding. He claimed it was just a prank gone too far. Greg, now sweating under pressure, repeated the same line to anyone who would listen. "It was just a joke," he said on camera, trying to smile, his voice cracking. "We were just having fun." But no one was laughing. The internet wasn't forgiving. The FBI wasn't silent. And Malcolm Reed, well, he wasn't done. Here's what the world didn't know. Malcolm Reed wasn't just some random agent passing through town. He was part of a federal task force investigating racial profiling in small-town law enforcement. His division had been quietly gathering data, records, and patterns from across several states. And guess which department was on that list? Fairview Police, Greg's department. The same one now, scrambling to bury the story before Washington started digging deeper. But Malcolm didn't strike back. He didn't storm into the precinct demanding justice. He didn't post any angry statements. When reporters found him outside his motel the next morning, cameras flashing, microphones in his face, he simply looked up from his coffee and said one sentence that set the internet on fire. "I'm more interested in patterns than apologies." That quote hit like lightning. It was replayed on every major network, printed on t-shirts, turned into memes. Social media exploded with hashtags like hashtag patterns not apologies and hashtag Malcolm Reed speaks. For some, he was a hero. For others, especially in Fairview, he was a threat. The town's reactions split right down the middle. Some locals whispered that Greg had it coming. Others doubled down, defending him. "He didn't mean it like that," one diner regular told the news. "That FBI guy's making a mountain out of nothing." But there was something else at play, something deeper. Fairview had always protected its own. When one of their own was accused, they closed ranks. They formed a wall. And behind that wall, the truth rarely got out. But this time, the truth had wings and millions of eyes watching. Meanwhile, Greg tried to act like life was normal. He went to work, kept his head down, and waited for it all to blow over. But inside, panic clawed at him. His phone buzzed constantly. Texts from other officers, old friends, even strangers sending hate mail and threats. The chief told him to stay quiet, not to engage. Just let it die down, he said. These things always fade. But Greg knew this one wouldn't. Not with Malcolm Reed involved. What Greg didn't know was that Malcolm hadn't left town. He was still there, quietly, deliberately staying under the radar. He booked another week at the motel under a different name, spent his days reviewing files, and watched how the department handled the fallout. Every move Greg made, every statement the chief gave, every whisper among officers, Malcolm noted it all. He was watching not for emotion, but for evidence. Because, for him, this wasn't personal revenge. It was data collection, a live experiment in accountability. But as the days passed, something strange began happening. Reporters who tried to interview Malcolm were told politely, he's unavailable. The FBI gave no official comments. And yet, mysterious black SUVs were spotted near the police station, parked quietly, engines off, windows tinted. Rumors spread like wildfire. They're here for Greg. They're auditing the department. They're about to shut the whole thing down. Nobody knew what was true, but everyone could feel it. Something big was coming. Greg tried to convince himself it would pass. He told his wife not to worry, though she could see the cracks forming. His confidence, the same arrogance that made him dump food on another man's head, was slipping away. He started avoiding the diner, avoiding public places. But fear has a funny way of finding you where you live. One night, after a particularly long shift, Greg pulled into his driveway. It was dark, the street silent except for the hum of distant crickets. He turned off his car, grabbed his bag, and stepped toward the house. Then he saw it, two black SUVs parked quietly across the street. Their headlights were off, but their silhouettes were unmistakable. At first, Greg thought he was imagining it. He rubbed his eyes, blinked twice, looked again. Still there. His heart began to race. Were they watching him? Were they here for him? He looked at his front door, then back at the cars. For the first time in his life, the man who'd laughed at others felt the icy grip of fear. He could almost feel the eyes behind those tinted windows, studying him, judging him. And though he tried to play it cool, his hands shook as he reached for his keys. Inside, his wife called from the kitchen. "Greg? You okay?" He didn't answer. He just stood at the window, staring out into the night. The black SUVs didn't move. They didn't need to. Their silence said it all. Greg swallowed hard, realizing something terrifying. This wasn't over. Not even close. Malcolm Reed hadn't just embarrassed him in a diner. He was dismantling everything Greg thought he controlled, piece by piece. And somewhere out there, maybe in one of those SUVs, maybe in some quiet office in town, Malcolm was watching. Calm, calculated, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. Fairview was about to learn that when you protect your own at all costs, sometimes the cost is everything. The next morning, the Fairview Police Department was buzzing with tension. Phones rang incessantly. Officers whispered in corners, and the fluorescent lights overhead cast a harsh, unforgiving glare on the walls. The chief had called an emergency meeting, one of those rare occasions when the entire department had to gather in the briefing room, a space usually reserved for mundane updates and scheduling. But this was no ordinary meeting. This time, the stakes were far higher. The FBI had officially launched an investigation into the department's practices, and everyone knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Officers muttered nervously as they filed in, glancing at each other like students waiting for a teacher's lecture, wondering who would be blamed first. Greg Turner arrived last, his uniform sticking to his back from nerves and sweat, his hair slightly disheveled as though the anxiety of the previous days had physically weighed him down. He tried to walk in confidently, to project the kind of bravado that had carried him through years of policing in a small town, but it was useless. There was an energy in the room he couldn't ignore, one of quiet authority, the kind that commands attention without raising its voice. The chief attempted to look calm, straightening his tie and adjusting his glasses as if to say, "Everything is under control," but even he betrayed a slight tremor in his hands. Then the door opened, and Malcolm Reed stepped inside. Suit sharp, tie impeccable, FBI badge gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. Every head turned. Every whisper died. The room felt suddenly smaller, tighter, as if the air itself had thickened. Malcolm walked slowly to the front of the room, his gaze sweeping across the officers like a hawk assessing prey. His presence alone made the strongest men in the room shift uncomfortably. He placed a large black file carefully on the table in front of the chief, and then leaned back slightly, his eyes locking with Greg's. His voice was calm, quiet, but carried the weight of authority that no uniform could ever match. "Gentlemen," he said, almost softly, "I'll be leading this review." The silence that followed was so complete, so intense, it could have shattered glass. Greg's mouth opened, then closed. He swallowed hard, his usual arrogance dissolved into panic. "Wait, you can't be serious," he stammered, voice cracking under the pressure. The words sounded childish in the presence of the man who had turned the tables in a single, measured sentence. Malcolm's gaze didn't waver. He leaned slightly forward and said, "Oh, I'm very serious. And this time, Officer Turner, I'll be watching who dumps on who." A ripple of laughter ran through the room, soft but unmistakable, not mocking, but nervous amusement. Even the chief couldn't hide a cough as he tried to regain composure, realizing that this investigation was no longer theoretical. Malcolm spent the next few days meticulously combing through the department's reports, body cam footage, and complaints that had been quietly buried over the years. Every file was a piece of a puzzle, and Malcolm put them together with precision. What he uncovered was worse than anyone could have imagined. Falsified reports, unjustified stops, misrepresented arrests, and a pattern of targeting black drivers that had gone unnoticed or ignored for years. Each revelation was another nail in the coffin of the department's credibility, a blow that made even the most hardened officers shift nervously in their seats. Every night, Malcolm documented his findings with the calm efficiency of a surgeon, cutting away the lies and exposing the truth. Yet despite the gravity of what he discovered, he did not gloat. He did not celebrate. Instead, he reached out to Greg privately, requesting a meeting. Greg, still trembling from the initial shock of seeing Malcolm in the department, hesitated. "Why me?" he asked finally, trying to sound braver than he felt. The words came out stiff and awkward, almost like a child seeking permission to enter an adult conversation. Malcolm leaned back, his expression unreadable, but his eyes heavy with meaning. "Because you represent more than yourself," he said. "You represent what happens when power meets prejudice." Greg's jaw tightened. He expected anger, wrath, perhaps a lecture meant to humiliate him further, but instead there was disappointment. Calm, deliberate, and far more cutting than any yell or insult could ever be. That single emotion, delivered without theatrics, struck deeper than Greg could have imagined. It made him reconsider every choice he had made, every assumption he had held about authority, control, and respect. He tried to speak, to defend himself, to explain away his actions, but before he could utter more than a stammered syllable, Malcolm leaned forward and dropped a bombshell that changed everything in that room. A revelation that sent Greg's mind into a spiral of disbelief and fear, one he wouldn't be able to shake for a long time. The weight of that moment was profound. Greg realized he wasn't just being investigated for a prank gone wrong. He was being confronted with the consequences of a lifetime of unchecked behavior. Malcolm's calm authority, combined with the undeniable evidence in front of him, made it clear this was not about punishment alone, but about exposing a system that had allowed abuse to go unchecked. Every file, every recorded complaint, every single pattern of misconduct pointed to a larger truth, one that Greg could no longer ignore. As the meeting ended, Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout or berate. He simply handed Greg a folder and said, quietly but firmly, "You need to understand the world you're in, and your place in it. Greg left the room that day feeling smaller than he had ever felt, the magnitude of Malcolm's presence and investigation pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. In that moment, the tables had fully turned. The predator had become the prey, the arrogant officer humbled, and the quiet agent in a black hoodie had proven that patience, intelligence, and authority could dismantle a lifetime of entitlement. One careful, calculated step at a time. Greg would never see the world the same way again. Malcolm Reed had made sure of that. Malcolm leaned back in the chair, the weight of the room suddenly shifting as he fixed his gaze on Greg. His expression was calm, controlled, almost serene, but there was a steeliness beneath it that made Greg's stomach knot. "The reason I was at that diner," Malcolm said slowly, deliberately, "wasn't random. I was watching you." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and undeniable. Greg froze, his eyes widening as his mind raced. Watching him? How could this stranger, this agent he had humiliated with such reckless arrogance, have been observing him? The thought made his heart hammer in his chest. He swallowed hard, the room suddenly too small, too close, the air thick with tension. "You've been under quiet investigation for months," Malcolm continued, his voice calm but firm, each word measured, precise. "We had complaints, numerous complaints, about excessive force, abuse of authority, even false arrests." Greg's eyes darted toward the door, imagining that escape was possible, imagining a way out of this confrontation that now felt less like a conversation and more like a reckoning. He could feel the weight of his past decisions pressing down, each memory of an unjust stop, each moment of arrogance replaying like a sinister montage in his mind. Malcolm's smirk was subtle, but cut like a knife. "Relax," he said, his tone almost conversational. "I'm not here to arrest you today. I'm here to show you what justice looks like when it doesn't wear a uniform." The line hit Greg like thunder. It wasn't just the words themselves. It was the authority, the calm power behind them. The reminder that real justice doesn't need theatrics, badges, or ego. It was silent, methodical, inescapable. Greg had spent years thinking the uniform gave him control, but Malcolm was showing him the opposite. Control wasn't about power. It was about responsibility. Malcolm's eyes held his, unflinching, as though daring him to challenge it. But Greg couldn't. Every instinct he had screamed to run, to defend, to rationalize. Yet he found himself paralyzed, facing a man who embodied the consequences of everything he had ignored or abused. Malcolm leaned forward slightly, his voice softening but gaining weight in the stillness of the office. He revealed something personal, something that made the confrontation sting even more. He had grown up in a town similar to Fairview, a place where fear and prejudice had touched his family directly. His father had been wrongly arrested by a cop who looked remarkably like Greg, arrogant, entitled, convinced of his own righteousness. But Malcolm's response wasn't anger, not revenge, not retaliation. Instead, he had chosen a path that required patience, intellect, and courage. He had decided to become the man who could change the system from within, to rise through the ranks, to wield authority in a way that ensured accountability and fairness rather than oppression. Standing there, face to face with Greg, he now had his chance to do just that. Greg's mind swirled with disbelief. Every smug moment he had relied on, every cruel joke, every abuse of privilege now seemed small, childish, and inconsequential against the backdrop of Malcolm's purpose. He realized, in a way that was terrifying, that he had been nothing more than a test case, a demonstration of the system's vulnerability, and Malcolm's presence was both the reckoning and the solution. The calm, controlled demeanor, the measured words, the precise timing, it wasn't arrogance. It was power in its purest, most effective form. And then came the real twist, the final escalation that made Greg's knees weak and his face pale. Malcolm reached into his briefcase and pulled out another folder, larger, thicker than the one he had shown him earlier. Its seal gleamed under the fluorescent light, intricate and official. Greg had never seen it before, not in the hundreds of hours he had spent in law enforcement, not in any document or file he had handled. He stared at it, Frozen. "What is that?" he managed to whisper. Malcolm's smirk deepened, subtle, almost imperceptible, as he placed the folder carefully on the desk. "It isn't just the FBI," he said, his tone flat but chilling in its authority. "This time, the Department of Justice is involved." The words hit Greg like a punch to the chest. His uniform suddenly felt meaningless, his badge worthless, his past decisions glaringly exposed. The DOJ, the very institution that could audit, investigate, and enforce federal accountability, was now officially engaged, and Malcolm was their point of contact. The weight of that knowledge crashed down on him. Every misstep, every act of arrogance, every unchecked exercise of power was now under scrutiny, not just from a local superior or the public, but from the highest levels of oversight. Greg's mind raced, a storm of fear, panic, and disbelief. He had laughed at Malcolm in the diner, thinking it a harmless joke, a moment of control over a stranger he assumed powerless. Now he realized that laughter had been a prelude to his own reckoning, and that the calm man he had humiliated held the authority and patience to dismantle everything Greg thought he controlled. Malcolm leaned back, watching him carefully, letting the silence stretch. The quiet was deliberate, suffocating, and every second added to Greg's mounting anxiety. He realized fully, for the first time, that authority without integrity is fragile, that power misused will always be challenged, and that the man in front of him embodied accountability in its most deliberate, unavoidable form. The room felt heavy, thick with tension. Malcolm's calmness, his deliberate pacing, his knowledge of every detail, and now the presence of the Department of Justice, all created a situation Greg could not escape, a lesson he could not ignore. For the first time in his life, he was not in control. The irony was bitter. The man he had humiliated with a plate of eggs was now the one orchestrating the fate of his career, his reputation, and his understanding of justice. And as Greg sat frozen, staring at the folder, at the badge, at the calm but unyielding figure before him, he understood one undeniable truth. The real power doesn't shout. It observes, calculates, and executes. And Malcolm Reed was the embodiment of it. In that moment, Greg Turner learned what it truly means to be held accountable, to face authority without ego, and to understand that real justice is not about uniforms or badges. It is about integrity, patience, and the courage to stand for what is right, even in the face of fear. The calm wasn't weakness. It was the most formidable force he had ever encountered, and the consequences were only beginning. The investigation into the Fairview Police Department didn't just make headlines. It exploded across national news like a bomb that no one could ignore. The story spread faster than wildfire, shared on social media, dissected on morning news shows, and analyzed on primetime investigative programs. The headline ran bold across news feeds and cable tickers. Cop's cruel prank backfires. FBI agent exposes entire department. It wasn't just the prank or the viral video anymore. It was the systemic abuse, the decades of unchecked behavior, the pattern of targeting black citizens, and the undeniable proof of misconduct laid bare by a calm, measured federal agent named Malcolm Reed. Protests erupted across the town, and even in neighboring cities, citizens demanding accountability, justice, and reform. People marched in front of the precinct, chanting slogans, holding up signs, and sharing stories of their own experiences with law enforcement. The atmosphere was tense, electric, and for the first time, many officers realized the depth of the mistrust that had quietly festered in the community for years. But Malcolm did something no one expected. He stepped into the media spotlight himself, not to lecture or gloat, not to humiliate or condemn, but to reshape the narrative. Standing in front of cameras, flashes popping, microphones shoved toward him, he addressed the nation with calm authority. This isn't about revenge. It's about rebuilding trust. The statement was simple, yet its impact profound. It shifted the conversation from anger to reflection, from retribution to reform. People stopped yelling for blood and began asking questions about the system, about accountability, and about what it truly means to serve a community with fairness and respect. It was a turning point that few anticipated, and it made Malcolm's approach even more formidable. Weeks later, the consequences for Greg Turner began to materialize, but not in the way the public assumed they would. Greg was suspended from the department, not fired outright, not thrown into obscurity, but placed into a structured, intensive program that Malcolm had arranged personally. The federal retraining program lasted a year and focused on bias awareness, ethics, cultural competency, and understanding the responsibilities of power. Greg, who had spent years relying on authority without reflection, now had to confront the human cost of his actions. He had to understand the systems he participated in, the lives he impacted, and the mistakes that could never be undone. The suspension, paired with retraining, sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community, signaling that accountability could coexist with opportunity for reform. Initially, people were furious. Public opinion demanded harsher punishment, some even calling for termination, arrests, or career-ending consequences. The anger was palpable, spreading through social media, phone calls to the chief, letters to newspapers, and town hall meetings. But Malcolm stood firm, calmly reminding the public of a lesson that few wanted to hear. If we only punish, we never change. The logic was irrefutable. Punishment alone addresses the symptom, but ignores the root of systemic issues. Malcolm's method emphasized learning, reflection, and transformation, ensuring that mistakes didn't just end careers, but became catalysts for real, lasting change. Months passed. The Fairview Police Department began to shift under scrutiny and guidance. Policies were rewritten. Hiring practices were revised to ensure diversity, equity, and accountability. Training programs were expanded and mandated. Officers received ongoing education in ethics, bias mitigation, and community engagement. One of the most remarkable changes was the launch of a mentorship program for young officers of color, designed to cultivate leadership, representation, and trust from within the ranks. Greg Turner, once the symbol of arrogance and disregard, eventually stepped into a leadership role in that program. His transformation became a case study of what Malcolm had promised: redemption through accountability and education. A year later, the culmination of this extraordinary journey was marked by a press conference that drew national attention. Malcolm and Greg appeared side by side, an image that stunned journalists, citizens, and law enforcement alike. Greg, visibly changed, looked out at the crowd, speaking with humility and reflection that few could have imagined a year prior. "I poured food on a man's head, thinking it made me powerful," he said, his voice steady but sincere. "But it only showed how small I was. He gave me a second chance, and I intend to earn it." The crowd held its breath as Malcolm, standing next to him, offered a slight smile, his expression calm, controlled, and confident. He added, "Justice isn't about who wins, it's about who learns." Applause erupted from every corner of the room, first hesitant, then thunderous, as the nation recognized the profound lesson unfolding before their eyes. Accountability and redemption are possible even in the darkest moments of failure. And what about the diner, the place where it all began? It still stands on Main Street, the same counter, the same worn booths, the same smell of coffee and syrup, but now it bears a small, discreet plaque near the counter. Respect is not optional. Patrons glance at it when they order, a quiet reminder of a story that transformed not just a man, but an entire community. The diner, once the site of humiliation, had become a symbol of learning, dignity, and accountability. It marked the place where one man's cruelty became another man's redemption, and where a small, thoughtless act ignited a national conversation about justice, empathy, and the power of transformation. In the end, the story of Greg Turner and Malcolm Reed is not just about a viral prank, a viral video, or the exposure of corruption. It is about the possibility of change, the courage to confront wrongdoing, and the profound impact that one calm, patient, and principled individual can have on an entire system. One man's humiliation became another man's opportunity to teach, to reform, and to build trust where it had been broken. And the world watched, learned, and in some ways, changed along with them. It is a lesson in dignity, in accountability, and the transformative power of justice done the right way. The story doesn't end here. It continues in every policy rewritten, every young officer guided, every community conversation sparked by that single, unforgettable act in a small-town diner. A reminder that respect, once lost, can be restored, but only when courage, patience, and accountability lead the way.